Christians always say that Jesus accepted worship, therefore Jesus must be God because people worship Jesus, according to the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, etc., etc. And it's true that people did worship Jesus. You know, according to the Gospel of Matthew, in the Gospel of Mark, etc., etc. I don't know the exact references, but it's there in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and the Gospel of John, etc. But the point is that just because people worship Jesus and Jesus did not reject their worship, that doesn't mean he's God. And the reason why is because of Daniel. Because if we look at the Old Testament, people worship Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 46 to 49. Well, who is Daniel? Who was Daniel? According to the Old Testament, Daniel was a prophet of God, according to the Old Testament. But anyways, the point is that if you read Daniel chapter 40, if you read Daniel chapter 2, verses 46 to 49, here's what it says. It says, the king Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your Lord is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all the wise men. So now pay attention to Daniel chapter 46, Daniel chapter 2, verse 46. The king worshiped before Daniel. He fell prostrate. That means he worshipped before Daniel. So the question really arises: is Daniel God, or is Daniel or because if the king is worshiping Daniel, it stands to reason that, according to the Christian theology that's coming from Jesus' worship, Daniel must be God too, because Daniel accepted worship and didn't reject to it. So you see, just because people worship Jesus, that doesn't mean Jesus is God, because according to the Old Testament theology, people worshiping another person, it was just a sign of respect. So the king was respecting Daniel. That's why he fell prostrate, or he worshipped him. Same thing with the disciples and the people around Jesus. They were worshiping Jesus because they were showing respect to Jesus. They didn't see him as a God. Jesus himself never said, I am God, and he never said, worship me. And the reason why Jesus has to say, I'm God, is because according to the Old Testament, in Exodus, Deuteronomy, etc., God says, I am God, worship me. Therefore, Jesus has to repeat those words if he is the God of everything, which he didn't repeat. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself, or I'm deviating from the main topic. The point is, according to the Old Testament, according to the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 46, the king worshipped Daniel. So what that means is that people would worship prophets of God or agents of God, to show respect to them, as the king did. So when the disciples are worshiping Jesus, they're showing respect to Jesus. They are not praising him as some kind of deity, or they're not praising him as they would praise God. Keep in mind, if you read the ending of the Gospel of Luke, the disciples went to the temple and praised God after Jesus' ascension. So what that means is that the disciples worshiped God in a different way than they worshiped Jesus. That means that the disciples worshiped God, and they didn't worship God in a direct way by going to the temple, as opposed to Jesus, as opposed to what they did to Jesus. So here, let me. You know what? Let's pull up that word. Let's pull up that verse right now, since we're going into the Bible. The book of Luke. Let's see here. Let's see here. It's all the way at the end. So 1 second. Let me get to that. All right, now pay attention to Luke chapter 24, verse 52 to 53. And they worshipped him, and they returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And they stayed continually at the temple, praising God. So the disciples praised God or worshiped God in a different way than they were praising or worshiping Jesus. So notice how the disciples, according to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 53, went to the temple or continually went to the temple praising God. Now notice how the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 53 doesn't say, and they went to the church and praised Jesus. No, the disciples, after Jesus' ascension, went to the temple and worshipped and praised God. So that means the disciples worshipped or praised God in a different way than they worshipped and praised Jesus. That means the disciples believed that God is, higher authority, or needs to be worshipped in a more direct way than Jesus. That means the disciples believe that God is one and he needs to be worshipped, directly, as opposed to the indirect way they were worshiping Jesus. So that's just my 2 cents on this whole Jesus accepted worship, therefore he must be God. Well, read the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 45 to 46. The king also worshiped Daniel. So what that means is, according to biblical theology, worshiping doesn't mean doesn't just because someone worships someone doesn't mean they're worshiping him as a god. It was just a sign of respect that these Old Testament figures or these biblical figures did to their teachers, being Daniel, Jesus, etc. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead.